Welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. We are your hosts, Dr. Scott Hoye, clinical psychologist,
and Kyle Miller, licensed counselor. Psychology Talk is a unique conversation about psychology around the globe. We speak with psychology experts to keep you informed about current issues and trends. We advocate toward reducing stigma and educate about mental health.
While you're listening, please take a moment to give us a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, or your favorite streaming service. It helps us to continue providing you with quality programming. And now, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Hoye. Today, I'm delighted to have Avigail Lev. Avigail Lev, or Abby as she likes to be called, is a cognitive behavioral therapist, author, mediator, and executive coach in San Francisco, California. She is the director of the Bay Area CBT Center, a clinic that specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy to help individuals and couples break unhelpful patterns, develop healthier habits, and improve all areas of their life. Abigail has co-authored 3 books on utilizing CBT to strengthen relationships, and she has presented her research at numerous conferences. You might have seen her work because it's been featured in Forbes, Dr. Drew, Bloomberg News, Huffington Post, Business Insider, MSN, and Psych Central, among many other spots on the web. And today she will be discussing healing from narcissistic abuse. Abby, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Well, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, your use of CBT. I know we were discussing earlier that you like to integrate schema therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy into your work with CBT to kind of make it more well-rounded, perhaps. How did you get started in this process of becoming a psychologist?
I was always just very curious about human behavior and why do we do what we do and what makes people feel happy or fulfilled or have a sense of meaning in their life. You know, I feel like when I was younger, I had a bit of an existential crisis, wondering like, what does this all mean and why are we here? And then I took some psychology courses and philosophy courses, and it resonated with what I wanted to learn and what I wanted to do in life.
Okay. Awesome. And so you somehow must have been intrigued by CBT. What was it that pulled you towards that particular frame of psychotherapy?
Yeah, I started out as an existential therapist, and then I got into schema therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. I do find that these third wave behavioral treatments are very similar to existential theory, and also they take a lot from Buddhist ideas and Buddhist philosophy, such as mindfulness and strategies for acceptance and self-compassion. So I think that treatments in general, psychotherapy has moved a little bit away from trying to change thoughts or find balanced thoughts and challenge beliefs. And it's moved more into how do we accept our internal experiences, our thoughts, feelings, sensations, urges. We learn a way to change our relationship with those so that then we can change our behaviors. And changing our behaviors is then what ends up making us feel better in the long run. But often people think we need to change how we feel before we could do something different. And it's actually the other way around.
Doing something different and therefore changing how we feel. Yeah, inside out. Correct. Sometimes helps very much so. Well, I know that you've given courses and have worked, as I have, with people who have suffered at the hands of narcissistic behaviors and people we might deem as narcissistic. Tell us a little bit about that, and I'm sure our audience is excited to hear about some of this.
Sure. I think that narcissistic personality disorder and personality disorders in general are quite misunderstood in our field. And it could feel quite scary to diagnose these or work on these in therapy effectively, especially if somebody's a grandiose narcissist, because then there's a lot of anger or rage and certain coping mechanisms that can feel quite scary. And so therapists have a hard time not only treating this, but being able to recognize it. And so part of the course is helping people distinguish between different kinds of narcissism, because what we are used to is, or what we learn about is the grandiose narcissist, and the grandiose narcissist is overt. And so they are easier to recognize and identify. But when you're dealing with somebody who has covert narcissism, that's the person that is really attentive and is listening and may seem really shy and vulnerable. And they are much more difficult to recognize. Mm-hmm. Although underneath the covert behaviors, there's still the grandiosity, the entitlement, the lack of empathy is still the same.
Okay. Well, how does it display itself? I mean, if you're describing somebody who could basically be introverted, and not to say that introverts are all hidden narcissists, but how would you describe for the audience how they could tell if somebody, not to say that we want people to go around diagnosing mental illnesses or disorders, but how would you describe what they might come across as?
Well, one common misconception about narcissistic personality disorder is that people who have NPD are wanting, they want approval or to be admired or to be liked. And so people confuse the term narcissistic supply with wanting attention and adulation. But actually, in reality, all people with NPD, whether they're overt or covert, they want control. And control looks differently than admiration. Mm-hmm. So what that means is they operate kind of like they're conditioning you, and they have a remote control, and they want to continue to reinforce you doing certain behaviors. So if they're pressing, for example, the guilt button, they want you to say sorry. Or if they're pressing the anger button, they want you to concede. Or if they're pressing the shame button, they want you to, acknowledge you've done something wrong. Or if they're pressing the, admiration button, then they want admiration or compliments. But in the reality, the goal is to have full control of the other person and to condition them. Oh, I'm so sorry. One moment.
That's okay.
They left.
Okay. Okay, you were saying they want control. In other words, they want to be able to condition the person to be. It's not necessarily admiration, but it is attention of some sort, and it's control of attention to be the center of attention.
So the way that narcissistic supply works mm-hmm. is the person who has NPD. It is actually a shame disorder. So this person feels a lot of shame about who they are. Yeah.
An inferiority complex. Yeah.
Inferiority, exactly. So it may appear like the entitlement and the grandiosity and being superior is a coping mechanism to actually feeling inferior. And so narcissistic supply functions as a way that the more that they feel that they could get you to act predictably and the way that they want, the more they feel superior and in control. And so they develop a false self, kind of like a mask mm-hmm. of this ideal version that they want to be. And their whole goal really is that this false self is very fragile. Mm-hmm. And when there's a crack in it, they fall into a deep narcissistic wound, which is very painful. It feels like a total loss of control, helplessness, right? Like impotence, just feeling really helpless in the world and powerless. And so they use this false self to get the validation and reassurance that they are this ideal self.
Okay. Yeah. And so basically, if they can rope someone in to their field or their magnetic pull or their gravitational field, so to speak, it's kind of hard to get out, right? Because it's a subtle manipulation.
Sometimes it can be subtle. With covert narcissists, it's more subtle. They're good at playing the victim and doing a reverse victim offender where they've done something wrong. Like they come in, they're meeting you at 8 p.m. They show up at 3 a.m. and you go, "Where have you been?" And they're very good at doing the reverse victim offender where suddenly they become the victim and you feel like the perpetrator. So they go, "How did you not know that I had this important work project and you don't pay attention to my life? And I've been stressing all day to get us money so that you can have the things you want in life." And they start crying and you're going, "Oh my goodness. I understand this. You tried your best to be here at 8. So the overt narcissist looks more like they appear superior and grandiose, and the covert is trickier because they can come across as the victim or shy and helpless, but underneath it, actually, the mechanisms are the same.
Okay. And so the more difficult one to discern and thus maybe pulled into a relationship would be the more covert type, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So there's a lot of gaslighting in either cases, but you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the term gaslighting, which has been kind of, along with narcissism, as kind of a negative thing to attribute to people, whether or not they're narcissists. Gaslighting is a term that's been used a lot in popular culture. Maybe you can speak a bit to that from a more professional opinion.
Sure. Gaslighting, overall, it involves many different techniques and strategies, but the goal is that it is an emotional abuse tactic to get the other person to start questioning their own reality and perceptions and make them feel doubt in themselves, make them feel crazy so that you have more control over them. People are very confused about gaslighting because they're wondering, does the person know that they're doing it? Do they not know that they're doing it? And they are confused about that there are actually many different techniques that fall under the umbrella of gaslighting. Mm-hmm. So, for example, projection, projective identification, reverse victim offender, minimizing, belittling, these are all parts and pieces of gaslighting. Triangulating is another form of gaslighting. So gaslighting is an umbrella term for doing lots of behaviors that start making the person doubt themselves and lose trust in their own perspective.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And that's where the abuse starts.
The abuse starts with the person with NPD love bombing and putting you in the ideal phase. And they start idealizing you, not because they know consciously that they're going to put you up on a pedestal in order to bring you down and destroy you, but because they actually do idealize people in the beginning and put them on a pedestal. And the more they feel that these people like them back, the more they idealize them. But then when you are in the relationship with them longer and longer, then they start devaluing. They split all of the negative pieces about themselves that they can't tolerate about themselves, and they start projecting it onto you. And then you go into the devaluation stage where then the person with NPD makes you kind of feel the way that they feel. And the more shame that you feel and the more out of alignment you behave with your own values, it turns into a trauma bonding experience because you then need them to make you feel okay about yourself. You end up feeling a lot of guilt and shame about yourself and your own behaviors, and you end up needing your abuser to validate that you're okay, that you're not bad, that you're not the abuser yourself.
Right. Okay. And so it becomes this vicious cycle where even as you talk about this, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, but I'm checking in with myself, the feeling is it would be pulled into this situation slowly. And at first, everything, if you meet somebody in an intimate relationship, you're always going to have all sorts of oxytocin, all sorts of endorphins, dopamine. The dopamine parts of our brain are turned on and off by this process, and you're looking for your cookie. You're looking for the reward, that feeling of being loved by this person, and then they eventually withhold that from you as punishment to possibly see, they're projecting themselves to not see those parts of themselves that they're in denial about. The false self versus their shadow parts that should be integrated to a holistic real self. Yeah. I feel kind of dirty just thinking about that. I feel kind of like yuck, but I know this, of course, going through this with patients of mine, and feeling what they feel empathically. Yes. So this is problematic. And this is very problematic. And so it's hard to not get into this. As you were talking about this devaluing real quickly, throwing a little bit of attachment theory here, I would say that this type of person would probably have more, maybe a chaotic attachment style, but more leaning towards a dismissive kind of an attachment style. I don't know if you would agree with that, or if you could address that.
Yeah. Right. It's like they may lean a little bit more towards dismissive avoidant, but actually most are in the disorganized. Right. So I'd say most people with NPD do have a disorganized attachment style, but leaning more towards avoidant. Yes. Right. But I think that the important point that you had made right now is the addictive quality of the relationship, because you're being idealized and love bombed, and you become addicted to this experience, feeling put up on this pedestal and adored and really seen. And therefore, what happens with the devaluation stage is then you start digging deeper and deeper and trying to prove yourself and getting out of feeling like the bad guy and getting out of the devaluation stage and back into being idealized, because of the oxytocin and the dopamine and the serotonin and this happy feeling that you're feeling, that it becomes like a drug addiction.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the person doesn't know what's real or what's not real after a while.
The
survivor, victim, the survivor.
The
yeah.
victim.
Yeah. I mean, the person,
yes.
I mean, you could say that, the reality orientation of the person with narcissism it's intact, but in a very skewed looking through a glass darkly at the world. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The person experiencing the abuse is also utilizing many defense mechanisms, and denial is one of them. Yeah. And they're experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance and confusion. Right. Yeah. And they're hearing a lot of gaslighting terms, right? Like, I never said that, or that never happened, or that's not how it happened. And it starts chipping away at their own trust in their own reality and in themselves, and kind of turning them into an addict, where they are becoming more and more dependent on the narcissist for their own self-worth, for their self-esteem. Once the devaluation stage starts, the person with NPD has already done several different kind of strategies, like, for example, isolating the person and triangulating them with others. And so the person's feeling alienated and becomes more and more dependent. And the more that they need to prove themselves, that's really what the narcissist is addicted to. They're not addicted to being admired or being adored. They're addicted to a person being so dependent on them that they could literally fall apart without them.
Right. Well, I mean, and this, you're right. And for the victim, I'm assuming that they might have more of a tendency towards an anxious attachment style. It's possible, not always, but possible.
So you're right that the person with NPD is more likely to be. So I think both people who are victims of narcissistic abuse and narcissists tend to mainly fall into the disorganized attachment, but leaning a little bit more towards avoidant for NPD and anxious ambivalent for the victim. That is correct.
Right. Because how else would one rope one in? So it's kind of this vicious cycle of feeding into each other. attachment disturbances. Yeah.
Correct. And I think that's what's so interesting about narcissistic personality disorder and many other personality disorders. They actually exist in a system. It takes two people to maintain a narcissistic dynamic. If the victim actually does not fall into this dynamic, right, like the victim also has certain schemas, core beliefs. So the victim has a core belief of self-sacrifice. Other people's needs are more important than my own. And the narcissist has certain schemas of entitlement. So entitlement is my needs are more important than others. And so when these two people get together, it creates a schema maintaining relationship. Both these people end up confirming the core beliefs of the other. And so it really gets maintained within a system. And if one person does not participate in the system falls apart, which is different from other diagnoses like depression or anxiety, which are more ego dystonic and more individualistic, as opposed to personality disorders that are in a system and are egocentric.
Right. They're reinforcing. Yeah. They make sense. You see them, your perspective taking position in life. Yeah. Your schema or schemas. Yeah. Well, how do you go about helping a person? Let's say somebody is maybe on the verge of figuring out that they've been abused and they're losing their sense of Stockholm syndrome within this kind of, situation, and they want to stop being a victim. How would you support one in a therapeutic manner?
Yeah. The dilemma is that when people are in a narcissistic abusive relationship, they don't realize that they're in one. So most of treatment is actually about getting the person to understand what's happening and that they are in an abusive situation, or that they are not engaging with somebody who's a willing participant. So people who have narcissistic personality disorder, their mind works differently than ours. They have a different agenda. Like if me and you are negotiating like what time we want to do this podcast, we have the same agenda. When you're negotiating, right? When you're negotiating with somebody with NPD, their agenda is not about negotiating fairly, reaching conclusions, or actual cooperation. Their goal is domination, control, and continuing to see the evidence that you are still, brainwashed by them. And so most of treatment is helping the person who's being gaslit or is in an emotionally abusive relationship understand that that's what's happening. Mm-hmm. And be able to understand the agenda of the person and the function of their behaviors, and assess whether the person that you're interacting with is a willing participant. Is this person impacted by your feelings and your needs? Or are they not? Do they have their own separate agenda? And so first, I want to help people be able to recognize it and understand that they're in an emotionally abusive relationship. Many of my clients that I see who have been in narcissistic abusive relationships are adamant about the fact that something is wrong with them. They tell me, no, Abby, I think I'm a narcissist. No, Abby, I have a borderline personality disorder. They have so much cognitive dissonance, and it's so hard for them to end the relationship. I think that there's a part of them that really wants to be the bad one, because as long as they're the problem, they can be the solution. And if the other person is the problem, then they're actually helpless. So it's interesting. The victim is also wanting a sense of control. They're wanting to control by being at fault. So as long as I'm at fault, I can change my behaviors and do something different. But actually, the person with NPD doesn't want you to do different behaviors, doesn't want you to get better. They want you to be the same. Yeah. They want you to keep feeling bad, keep feeling guilty, and keep being under their control. And so 80% of the treatment is helping the person realize, no, you do not have this personality disorder or that personality disorder or this. You do have some codependent qualities because you're taking on responsibility and you're wanting another person to change by you just being good enough, right? Like if I just say it the right way or behave the right way, they won't hit me, right? Like that's also a form of control, right? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to control your actions by being different, and we can't control other people, right? Like a person either hits or they don't hit, and you're not the cause of that person's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors.
Correct.
So step one of treatment, Step one of treatment is first helping the victim see all of this, understand it, recognize it, and acknowledge the actual dynamic that's happening. Once they see what's happening, and I often help them learn certain tools for communication, like nonviolent communication. It's really important to be effective, connect with your values, and track everything. You want to write things down, text everything, be clear on your reality and be grounded in your own perspective. And then once they start seeing it, getting them to move out of the relationship becomes much easier.
Okay. Any other tactics that you might use in that? Like you mentioned nonviolent communication, basically assertiveness training, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And what does that look like for this victim who's trying to kind of pull themselves out of this situation?
So I teach clients several different strategies for cultivating detached empathy. Mm-hmm. Empathy without responsibility. People who are codependent, it's hard for them to be able to distinguish between the difference of caring about somebody's feelings and experiences without feeling like I'm the cause of it versus feeling like I'm the cause of their experience and their behaviors, and then me taking responsibility for me doing something different so that they can change. So detached empathy is something that I teach clients in a way that they could empathize with the person who's having pain, but also be able to have this distance, be able to watch the dynamic like you're watching a movie, kind of separate your own ego and your own experience from it and have a real curiosity and use specific formulas like nonviolent communication in such a way where you could really assess whether somebody's a willing participant. So for example, if I say to you, me and you decide that we want to have dinner, and I say, okay, well, why don't I cook the dinner and you'll do the dishes? And you say, great. So then I cook the dinner, and then you decide you don't want to do the dishes, and you do certain gaslighting behaviors. That's not what we agreed, or that's not what we said, or I'm really tired, or why do I have to do it right now? Why does it have to be when you want it? Why are you so controlling, right? Projection. So now I'm going to use nonviolent communication to be assessing whether you're influenced by my feelings and needs and whether you're a willing participant. So I may say something like, Scott, when we make an agreement and you don't follow through in the way we agreed, I feel hurt, angry, disappointed, and I need consistency and follow through. Would you be willing to follow through with our agreements next time? Let's imagine that if you start doing some gaslighting, I would just teach certain strategies for example, the broken record. I would just repeat myself over and over again, but I feel hurt and alone and disappointed, and I still need consistency. Would you be willing to do this?
Okay. Yeah.
Now, if the person's not willing to do this, we see they're not a willing participant. If the person says, yes, sure, I'll do this, and then you do it again, and they do the behavior again, now you have to do certain behaviors to give self-care consequences. So let's imagine we do this again and you do the same thing. This never happened. I don't remember. Then we go, okay, next time we have agreements, I'm going to send you a text so that we're clear on our agreements. So now I send you a text. We're having dinner at 8. You will be doing the dishes at 10. Then we come back to it and you're still not doing the dishes, right? So now I could do some self-care consequences. I could say, well, the next time that I cook dinner, I won't cook dinner unless you show me that you have gotten a cleaning service, or I won't cook dinner unless you bring plastic forks and silverware, right? And plates. Or I could say, moving forward, the only way that we can have dinner together is if you cook and I'll do the dishes. So I start doing self-care consequences. And when you start doing self-care consequences with a person who's not a willing participant, what they will do is they will either get angrier and angrier, up the ante, or leave you. And I help people tolerate that, have this detached empathy and mindfulness and enough self-compassion and self-respect to do the formula while really paying attention and allowing the person to walk away, or do the actions or see where it goes so that you could protect yourself. So
that inner work for the person you might be seeing in the consulting room for the therapy, you're teaching them, you're giving them a hefty dose of what we would call psychoeducation, right? A lot of psychoeducation, so they can kind of see this, helping them to kind of build some insight into what this other person is about and how they're staying locked in this dyad, this unhealthy dyad or triad, if it were, and helping their self-esteem. It looks like what are some of the techniques, or how do you empathically help that person to be empathic with themselves and be able to say, this is what I want, this is the respect how do you teach them about non-negotiables in relationships when non-negotiables have never been in their headlights?
That's exactly right. That's exactly it. So I have many different strategies that I use. I want to say that when I'm doing the psychoeducation, there's a piece of the psychoeducation where I just educate them, but there's also a piece of the psychoeducation where I'm helping them get curious and use certain techniques and assess for themselves. And so I help them think about, well, what would it be like for you if somebody says to you, I feel hurt, or I feel devastated, and I need compassion, or I need follow through, or I need empathy. Like, would you be influenced by this experience? And I also help them do behavioral experiments. So the same ways that you're trying to assert yourself or express yourself with the person with NPD, it's really important to do that with many other people, so that you see that this is not about you or you doing something wrong, that this is most people who actually care about your experience will be influenced by your feelings and needs. Most people, and when people are being victimized and in an emotionally abusive relationship, they are in the moment so dysregulated and feeling so crazy and feeling so out of control and so confused that they're dissociating. They're not really able to stay really present and look the person in the eye and go, whoa, this person is not actually feeling my experience at all. And maybe they're actually, I can see in their eye and in their duper's delight and in their smile that they get a sense of pleasure when I'm suffering like this. And so I help them be really present. Number one is identifying your values. So values are very different from goals, because goals are achievable and values are a constant process. They are like a compass that is guiding our actions. So a goal is like, getting a job, and a value is working and being compassionate, being cooperative, being supportive, being encouraging. So we could never be 100% our values. At every moment is a choice to take an action that either brings us closer to the kind of person that we want to be or further away. So when you are in a relationship with somebody with NPD, whether it's your boss or whether it's a coworker or your partner, the more out of alignment you behave with your own values, the deeper you get into the system of starting to feel the shame and the guilt and feeling at fault and getting into that dynamic. And so helping them notice that regardless of what they're feeling and their internal experiences, they have the same choice to move towards their values in the moment. So being present, being curious, being assertive. And really, I think that with abuse victims, being present is one of the most important values, because they are so dissociated that they're not able to really assess the situation in the moment. And the goal in trusting yourself is being able to trust your own assessments in the moment.
Right.
And so doing behavioral experiments helps them build that trust in their own perception. You do the nonviolent communication formula with this person with NPD, and you do it with many other people, and you get really curious, like an investigator. How do other people respond to this?
Mm-hmm. So kind of helping them cultivate that sense of curiosity, the stance of the therapist, right? And in this case, of course, the CBT therapist, that curiosity, yeah. Going back and correcting maybe mistakes that they've been making for years. Well, you mentioned values, and as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, how many people could easily fall into the trap of an abusive relationship like this with an NPD or other type of person simply because they just haven't thought about their values. They might have a good, strong sense of what those values are, but have people really sat down and thought about what their values are? That might be something that's really important for society on the whole to do more explicitly and check in with yourself on a regular basis to see if they're still the same, like in 7 years or so, or 5 years or whatever.
Right. I am such a big fan of values. I think that they are just so critical. I can't even describe. When I'm working with a couple and I just help them just identify values and bring presence to it, like put both feet on the ground, connect with, with being grounded and feeling the roots, in the bottom of your feet and connecting with values of empathy, compassion, presence, curiosity. That alone will change the dynamic of the conversation. If they're negotiating or expressing a feeling or making a request, just connecting with their values alone, even without teaching them skills, will change the dynamic of the conversation. It's that powerful.
Yeah.
Like me connecting with being curious, being present, being authentic before I do a podcast. When I do that, the interview goes so much better than if I do not connect with my values right beforehand.
Right.
So I think both are true. Like one, that there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. And many people get into a lot of toxic relationships because they're not clear about their own values and what they want to be about. And also, what are the values that they want in relationship? What are the qualities that they're looking for in a partner? We often think that we want qualities rather than values. Like they're funny, they're intelligent, they dress nice. But actually what we should be looking for is, are they loyal? Are they honest? Are they authentic? Are they consistent? Because people could dress differently, and we can get to know someone and have the same inside jokes or read the same books and get on the same level, but values are not changeable. If somebody's not loyal or not honest, that cannot be changed in relationship.
Correct. Yeah.
So on one level, I think that we all need to connect with our values more. And on another level, I think that people with covert narcissism are very good at mirroring for us our values. And so in the beginning of a relationship, it's quite tricky to be able to distinguish between whether that person is just mirroring those values that we want to be about, or whether they're actually enacting them. So it's first being clear on your values, but then being clear on being able to distinguish between what somebody is saying and what they're doing. Often when we're meeting people, we take their words more seriously than their actions. Yeah. So what does it look like to evaluate? Like somebody's telling me that they're honest and loyal and committed, but are they showing me this?
It's on their behaviors, their actions, correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And in an abusive relationship, that shows up later, right? Kind of like the boiling frog. So by the time that you see it in their actions, you're already quite addicted.
Right. Right. And and also your perception is greatly skewed. Greatly skewed.
Correct.
Yeah.
Very.
Okay. What do you think? Like I think that experts have been saying that narcissism has been kind of burgeoning. It's been growing and growing in our society, especially with the advent of social media. Everybody feeling so prone to show their best face or their ideal image of themselves in social media or elsewise. Do you think that narcissism is really is growing and becoming more of an issue? I think you mentioned earlier, it's like the next pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's definitely growing. I think it is problematic. For example, there's research that shows that about 1 out of 5 CEOs is on the psychopathic spectrum. And
Right.
so, yeah, what's very disturbing about narcissism is not just that it's growing, but that places where it shows up the most is in positions of power and authority. And that's a big concern for society, as a collective. It's interesting because my hypothesis about why narcissism is growing is actually a little bit different than the idea of like social media and people putting themselves out there. Like that's the kind of narcissism that's more about image. Mm-hmm. But the piece about narcissism that's more concerning is the lack of empathy and the willingness to step over somebody else, right, in order to move forward, right? Like kind of to put your needs above others at any cost. And I think that part of why that is growing in our society and in our collective is because we're not educated enough and we don't understand the disorder enough. And what happens is that we think that these people are comfortable in their skin and confident, right, and well-meaning, and we end up rewarding narcissistic behaviors in our culture. And so part of why this is continuing to grow is because we don't know, right? Like for example, if we're thinking about like a psychology organization, we have a lot of people with NPD in every organization, mm-hmm. and they're usually at the top, and they're usually the ones that speak the most, and they're usually the ones that get away with the most. And we as a collective, we don't really know how do we respond effectively to these kinds of behaviors, because there are certain things that we do that end up rewarding them. Even if we think that it's a punishment for other people, it's actually a reward for the person with NPD.
Okay. Well, in what way is it a reward, Abby?
So, for example, if somebody was yelling at me or becoming really angry at me or guilt tripping me, mm-hmm. I would feel really bad. Like that would be like a punishment. I wouldn't want that coming at me. But the person with NPD feels superior from that. Oh, they feel a sense of pleasure from that. So if we're responding in certain ways, like seeking approval, getting enraged, being agitated, the person with NPD again, and I also want to put out there that people with narcissistic personality disorder are suffering. They're also victims of themselves as well. I've heard one person with NPD describe the disorder like he feels that when he can't control somebody else, it's like he can't move his own arm, because people with NPD see other people as an extension of themselves, literally. So can you imagine what it's like if you're trying to pick up your cup of coffee with your arm and your arm cannot pick that coffee up and you feel this frustration, right? Or you could even imagine when you're trying to get your technology to work. Have you ever gotten so enraged because you're trying to get technology to work and it's not working and you feel like you just want to break things, right? Like that's the narcissist, like constant experience is that frustration. And so when they see you have a response, any response is narcissistic supply. Flipping out, getting angry, crying, feeling guilty, saying sorry. These are all rewards. And as a society, we don't understand that we are rewarding behaviors we want to decrease.
Yeah, and sometimes I think that sometimes when I see people going through separation and divorce with someone who might fit the bill, I think that they can play the system very easily, right? They know how to play the system. If you think, like, for instance, if you like, I can't imagine feeling like everyone else is somehow attached to me. I mean, that's just such a strange, the way you're describing that, that description you heard. It would be painful to feel like you're somehow connected to everybody and that you need to manage the good opinion and the behavior of everyone around you. It's time consuming.
It takes a lot of energy.
Yeah. An extreme amount of psychic energy is wasted.
For sure.
And yes, society is kind of like reinforcing this behavior. I also think that you mentioned lack of empathy. There's not, instead of empathy, which a narcissist tends to lack, they have this strange connection to others as a projection, a projected self, right? I mean, is what you're saying.
It's the distinction between warm empathy and cold empathy. Cold empathy is a cognitive understanding of empathy. It's perspective taking. Mm-hmm. And warm empathy is actually feeling what the other person is feeling. So, for example, there's research that shows that if you show people who are high on narcissism, let's say a video of somebody going through pain and suffering, they will be above average in their capacity to describe what's happening for that person. They'll be able to say, well, she's probably really hurt because this person reminds her of her mother and it's bringing up her very core pain around shame and insecurity. They'll be able to really put themselves in the other person's shoes and understand how they're thinking and feeling. But physiologically, they're not impacted by it. So if we look at certain measures of their heart racing, right, or sweat response, they are not actually physiological impacted. I'll say that again. They are not actually physiologically impacted by that person's suffering. And so what's very interesting about the disorder is that they are cognitive empathy or cold empathy. They are above average. So they come across as somebody who's very emotionally intelligent and attuned and can read people well, but emotional empathy, warm empathy, they're below average. Right. And therefore that means they're not really impacted. And sometimes even their reward parts of their brain light up when people are suffering and in pain. One of the I could see why there might be an issue. Like there's some people, maybe if they have alexithymia, they don't know what their emotions are. They might lack empathy as well. They might have more of a cognitive form of empathy rather than an emotional or warm empathy. So there might be like some sort of overlap here, but the difference being, I think, is the need. The reward system of the narcissist, person suffering from this disorder, is triggered by that interaction nonetheless. It's like their interpersonal dynamics are necessary. Somebody who's autistic or has alexithymia, they might be more just shut down in general and not requiring an interaction with another person. Maybe in some cases. Yeah. Well, what I find, for example, is the psychology field has not separated warm and cold empathy enough for us to really have an understanding of this. Yeah. So in my personal experience, in my personal experience, people on the autism spectrum are actually not below average on warm empathy. They could be a little bit below average or even above average. Like we could look at that girl, what's her name? She's on the autism spectrum, Thunberg, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
That young girl who's all about climate change.
The climate change person.
I mean, she has a lot of empathy, right? Greta Thunberg, yeah. So people on the autism spectrum they're way below average on cold empathy. But actually, if you tell them,
they can't describe necessarily what they're feeling, right? Yeah.
or they can't tell what you're feeling. So for example, I had a client with autism, and he would ask me like, what is that face? Or what are you feeling? Or what are you thinking? And I'd go, what do you think? And he goes, well, you look really happy. And I'd go, actually, I'm feeling a little confused. So they have a hard time distinguishing. But then once they know what's happening and you give them like how you're feeling, you tell them what's happening for you, they don't lack warm empathy. So they do feel. If you say to them, I feel really sad or I feel really lonely, they will have an emotional response and they'll have empathy. They'll have warm empathy. It's just hard for them to read the other person and to read themselves and to tolerate their emotions. For the narcissist, actually, that's very easy. But the narcissist is not emotionally impacted. They're not having an actual response to it.
And so they're rather empty emotionally.
Certainly people with NPD have emotions. They have a lot of anger. They have envy. They have rage. They have a lot of frustration and helplessness. Mm-hmm. They lack certain emotions such as this capacity to feel happy for somebody else, to feel like a joy for somebody else. They're stunted in feelings of joy, connection, like guilt. They are low on guilt, but high on shame. So often when you're interacting with someone with NPD, it may seem that they're feeling guilty, but they actually are feeling ashamed. So if I punch someone and they tell me, ouch, that hurts, and I go, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, you must be feeling really hurt and upset and scared. That's an example of me feeling kind of guilty, like I feel really bad. But if I go, oh my goodness, I can't believe I punched you in the face. I'm the worst person in the world. You must hate me. I'm awful. I'm miserable. How could I have hit you? That's more of an example of shame. And shame is more self-absorbed and guilt is more interpersonal. And so when we're really educated on this disorder, we could understand the function of the person's behaviors in the moment and make more sense of why things are happening and what they mean.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I see we're just about out of time for today. Maybe if there's anything you want to say to kind of wrap up on the topic, Abby.
Sure. I would say that, let me think for a second.
All right. How do you sum up something so big? And by the way, this has been a wonderful explanation, and you've had you obviously have thought about this quite a bit and put this into perspective that works. As you were going through it, I'm having to say I do much of what you're describing kind of naturalistically. I have wound up working this way with victims of narcissistic abuse this way. And this has been like, oh, okay, that's where I was, okay, this makes sense. Really amazing insights about empathy in autistic people versus empathy in someone who has psychopathy, and that distinction between warm and cold or intellectual cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. Really a lot to digest and think about, and hopefully people in the audience will be helped by this to either avoid these kind of relationships in the future or to help have some insight and help to get themselves out. But if you would like to sum up something or say something else, add something to this, if we haven't covered something that you really are itching to talk about.
I would just want to say that, with this global pandemic and the things that are happening in our government, and our government is showing us a lot about narcissistic dynamics and how they play out, very similar to what you were saying about how they work the system. I mean, what's scary about this disorder is not how it shows up just on the individual level. What's concerning is how it shows up systemically. There's a very interesting book called, what is it called?
I'm sure it's very interesting. Yeah.
It's like Narcissism and Corporate Decay. It talks about how narcissism shows up in large corporations. And it talks about narcissism not just as an individual issue, but how it shows up in a system, in a collective. And so I think that when we could see how interdependent we are, and that somebody in China can play with a bat and impact the entire world the way we've all been impacted, it's even that much more important for us as a collective to have the skills and the tools to defend and overcome narcissism in others, in ourselves, and in our global, macro environment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. We are living in more of a monolithic society that's more and more disconnected. So it will reinforce disconnection among people and lack of empathy. I think that
that's exactly
it potentially could. We don't know that. We could hypothesize that. I don't know how you would study that on a global level. And
or we could just move towards being kinder, right, and more compassionate with ourselves and with others if we're hypothesizing that, right?
Yeah.
We just move towards,
How do we get so distracted and pulled away from from our inner narrative and our values? I also think that there has been I've discussed this with a filmmaker friend of mine. There's been just such a reach for the lowest level of human behavior in drama on television. And we're being just spoon-fed such, it was okay when it was like one show, like Breaking Bad perhaps, or Dexter. But now everybody is horrible and self-motivated and disconnected from each other. There are very few Ted Lassos out there, it would seem, but not everybody is. I mean, a psychopath. Thank God. But
then the question becomes, why do we idealize them, right? Like we have that show on Netflix called You, where the guy's a psychopath, and there's so many women in the United States that are idealizing him as like the man that they would want to be with. And so we really want to think about as a collective why we do that. And also, the other piece is that I've been thinking a lot about is how on TV right now, there aren't any shows or movies or anything that is showing the pandemic. And so we are being gaslit by the media all the time as if nothing's really happening in the world. We're being gaslit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the reinforcement of Western, so-called Western ideals of individualism. I don't think that that's something to sell refrigerators and washers and dryers, right? I mean, that's not real. I think people are generally nice to each other for the most part. And it's so easy to become cynical and jaded. Not to say that, there are some people who do fit the bill of having pathological narcissism that we have to avoid. But yeah. I think that it's a fascinating topic, and you mentioned You, and I did see that you have an article out there. I will put a link in that if you'd like to come back in and do just a fun show about that. Maybe some other television depictions of narcissism. Maybe we should set something up. That would be fun. Or another topic.
I do that a lot. I write a lot of articles around television depictions of things like Yellow Jacket's depiction of trauma, or You's depiction of narcissism. I love thinking about how shows and movies are depicting psychological ideas.
Well, maybe we could have you back on and we can come up with a scorecard. for each show, which one is actually working well, and that would be kind of cool.
Right.
Well, how can people reach out to you if they want your assistance for coaching, consulting, education, or anything else? How can they reach out to you?
I have two websites. I have the Bay Area CBT Center, so it's bayarea.cbtcenter.com. And then I have CBT Online. It's just cbtonline.com. I also have 3 books on Amazon, which is Act for Couples, Act for Interpersonal Problems, and then the Interpersonal Problems Workbook. And also I have an online course that talks about how to work with clients who are survivors of narcissistic abuse. And you could find that course on CBT Online. And I also have a lot of questionnaires that people could take if they're curious to find out about their own schemas and core beliefs. I have a schema questionnaire, self-compassion questionnaire. I'm a big fan of questionnaires.
Awesome. Yeah, and people like to do those too. So, all right. Well, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Abby Lev, thank you so much for your time. It was really fascinating. We'll do this again, hopefully.
Yes, thank you. It's fun.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Psychology Talk podcast. This podcast is intended for informative and entertainment purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. All material, copyright, the Psychology Talk podcast. Music is provided by the oddly Italianate named band Serenati. Ciao.